We're back with an amendment to the Nebula bonus section because Acoustica Audio has put out a new Aqua plugin. At the time you watch this video, it may not be new anymore, but they've put out an Aqua plugin, and this time it's a compressor. So if you think back a few videos ago and we talked about the compressors inside of Nebula itself, it's always a bit of a crapshoot as to whether or not that's going to do what we want it to do, because you can imagine that for each of those programs, you just have one preset going on the compressor. Whatever that person has decided to put the settings at, that's what you're given, that's what you get. And while you have some controls, the controls never act or react in the way you would expect them to on a normal dynamics processor. So it's kind of hit or miss, and that's because we don't see the normal user variable controls in one of those Nebula programs, right? We have something like ratio, but that's really controlling more of like a knee setting. We have attack, but is it really reacting like the attack on a compressor? You never know unless you try it out. But most of the time, you kind of want to leave the settings as they are and hope that it fits the source material. Well, luckily here with this Aqua plugin, we see something we're more familiar with, at least with dynamics processing, and that is, actual ratio controls, an actual attack setting, an actual release setting. So we'll feel a lot more comfortable and a lot more confident working with the technology when we see settings like this and when they react in the way that we expect them to react. Now, unfortunately, maybe fortunately for some of you, we do have to work up to this compressor because it's important to understand where this kind of fits in, what it's useful on. And that's such a difficult thing to try and teach people and a difficult thing to explain because in general with compression, hearing it can be tough. And the reason hearing it can be tough is because all compression is an automatic volume control, right? If I'm playing back this drum loop, and I want to quote unquote add more punch to it, I could try to manually adjust this so that each time one of those major hits comes through, I yank down on this and then I bring it back up and I get ready for the next one. I yank down, I bring it back up. That's really what compression is. And if I was to do that myself, it would be very obvious, it would be very inconsistent, and therefore something that the listener would get annoyed by, something that would really drive them crazy. They wouldn't like the track. It would be obvious that some crazy guy is just trying to automate gain faders and he's clearly not done the best job of it. That's where the dynamics processor comes into play because it can be consistent. It does exactly what you expect it to do, or at least in the digital domain with your stock compressor, it is doing exactly what you set up. So if we want to add more punch to this drum loop, we can start to bring in some ratio. Let's go with a sharp knee for this, start to bring this down. And so if we take this off right now, for most of you, or at least for some of you, and this isn't really a bad way of interpreting hearing this either, is it sounds like it's gotten quieter, right? That's really what we hear first off, is that it's getting quieter. So we're not adding punch right now. We're actually literally reducing dynamic range, and that's because our attack setting is all the way down to 0. So we have this nice little graph, and we can see that we are clamping down on that initial transient. Is that what we wanted to do? No, but this would be an application of actual, like true dynamic range limiting style compression. And we could bring the output up and actually make this appear as though it's louder because we are bringing down those transients. But if we want punch, we need to let those transients come through. So I can just take that attack setting and I can even use this little visual to help me, and we'll wait and see when we get past that transient, and then I'll know I'm in the right ballpark. So now you might be listening to this, and the thing you might be noticing or thinking is it still sounds as though it's getting quieter, but let's actually check our meters here and see if it actually is getting quieter. And if it is getting quieter, we'll apply some of the makeup gain on here. So here it is without. Nope, we're still coming out to around minus 11.1. And the reason is because our attack time is so slow, well, not that slow, but it's slow enough where we're not actually capturing any of those transients. And this is the way that you would add, quote unquote, more punch. We're letting the transient come punching through, and then we can set the release kind of to taste, but we want the release to be slow enough where we're not just instantly hearing it suck back up. Otherwise, we may lose some of that punch. We'll experiment with it. And the compression is now occurring so quickly and so briefly that we're not even really seeing that meter move. So just listen to the front part of the transient on the kick drum now. You hear that extra punch that's been brought in, right? And you can see the way that it's cupping right around the drum hit. And that would be the way that I would say add more punch to this drum loop. Part of the issue is that the only hit that it's really triggering on is the kick and the snare. But oftentimes in the loop, that's what you'd be looking for to add the punch to. You're not really going to be able to add punch to a hi-hat or something like that. So with this dynamics processor, if we really go extreme with the settings, it's pretty obvious to hear that something is happening. Right? And that's why we would choose to use something like this. We get exactly what we expect. But with analog processors or with hardware in general, things don't usually work out so perfectly. And that's because you don't have formulas and analysis tools measuring everything that's coming in. It takes a little bit longer usually. And that's why most analog compressors really don't handle transients all that well unless they're designed to be specific peak type limiters, in which case then they can usually handle it. But even so, there's usually some struggles along the way. So we can now move in and start to get into character compressors. And this is a compressor that we haven't looked at before, but is actually very similar to the tan that we will be getting to in a minute. And we can imagine that this compressor is supposed to be designed as like a punch compressor. But let's listen to what happens when we have none of these buttons engaged. Add a little makeup gain here. Try to get even. We can see we're still getting a decent amount of gain reduction in here, in that we could even take this up by maybe 2 more dB to match. It's like minus 11 was around where we needed to get to. Okay, a little too much. All right, so the question I'd have is, to your ear, does that sound as though it's gotten significantly more punchy? To my ear, it doesn't really sound like it. If I was to do a double blind and somebody had those settings, I would know something has happened, but I probably wouldn't be able to tell you what it was. And that's me being honest. Do I have the most golden of ears? No. Am I listening back on the most hi-fi system? No. But is the average listener listening back on the most hi-fi system with golden ears? Not really. So you're questioning, well, this is supposed to be a character compressor. We're supposed to be getting some punch, but I'm not hearing any of that. You know, it just kind of sounds like things have been, dare I say it, glued together a little bit, right? So we'll come back to that idea in a second. But we can get more punch out of this compressor, and we can do so by using the relaxed control and also the negative control. Deep is useful even just on its own because that's going to mean that the low end isn't necessarily going to trigger the compression. It's going to leave that kind of alone. And that will be useful because it'll allow our kick drum to start pounding back through. So with the deep engage, it sounds like even less is going on, really. This is now just more of kind of this meshy, gluey sort of feeling, which is hard to describe to people, but I'm not really hearing like audible compression, not in the way that we're used to hearing it described or defined is probably the right term for that. People always define it as like something very audible, a clear gain reduction occurring or clearly letting the transient through, but that doesn't seem to be happening here. But we can make it happen, and we're going to do that by using relaxed, which is going to allow more of the attack to come through. So now listen to that kick drum. Right? Kind of stale. Now both the kick and the clap are really popping through and kind of punching you in the face to a degree where I'd probably have to go in and maybe mix them down a little bit. We can get even more extreme with this. Now let's listen to the kick and snare, especially the front transient. Right? Very lifeless on that snare. Now it's really punching you right in the face. And we're bringing in a lot of gain, and that's okay because really we are letting the transient sneak through. And if we still want to maintain the balance on everything else, we are still changing the volume quite a bit. It's just not changing the front part of the signal at all, right? So that's kind of the distinction there, and that's what you're listening for. Now, this is almost certainly more of a character compressor because we're getting that punch. And so this brings up a really interesting kind of historical tidbit for you all. It's something that many of you are already aware of, and maybe some of you even own an SSL channel strip, or I think Waves has like this SSL bundle where you get the channel strip, you also get the bus compressor. And so you're wondering, okay, well, why is there a compressor on the channel strip, and why does it sound so much different to the one that's on the bus? And that is the perfect distinction for when we're using a plugin like this with all of the buttons off, a little bit more of a glue, a little bit more of the bus. And what happens when we bring some of these guys on, a little bit more of the channel strip. The channel strip compressor on the SSL is a very famous punch compressor. You can really hear it. Even with the fast attack times on there, it still struggles to grab the initial part of that transient. Whereas on the bus compressor, it's really designed not to be something that you're really audibly or obviously hearing a lot of extra punch brought in, but it's supposed to bring everything together. And so if you're saying, well, what does bus relate to in the DAW? It relates to the master output or even your group outputs, because that is what the bus is. The bus is all of the tracks coming together, summed together, and then output somewhere. So that's why on the master track, you often put something like a compressor on there, because that compressor is then used to try and bring it all together a little bit. And that's the point of the TAN here. It really does fall into the SSL bus compressor type style, where it's meant to be more of a glue and less of a really obvious audible sort of pumping effect, a punchy effect. You can kind of get it into that range, but it's very difficult to do, or it's not very difficult to do. It's just not going to be as obvious as if you were to use something like the DCA 1.2 and start really kind of using the settings we used before. So let's compare these guys a little bit. And, there's not that much to talk about with the TAN compressor. It's pretty straightforward. It gives you that added benefit that Nebula gives you. It does sound amazing, but it's important to understand how it can be used. So let's start by having the TAN compressor here on these drums, and let's try to add some punch into it, okay? And let's not forget that it is always a good idea to have your analog style gain staging coming in. And right now it's a little bit too quiet, so let's bring this up. Okay, so now we're a little bit more in the zone there. We've brought the tan in. Like all great things with Nebula, we're able to bring the preamp in, which even on its own is going to help this sound. Even doing nothing to this, it should start to glue it together, but that's not our function here, so we are still looking for punch. But I will bring the preamp in anyway. All right, so we're going to want to have relatively slow attack. This is like 10 milliseconds here. So, right, you can't really trust this gain reduction meter. It doesn't move as fast as it probably should. But even with this slower attack and fairly aggressive ratio, I'm not hearing a whole lot of extra punch brought in. Try messing with the release to help. So maybe there we're getting some. Little makeup gain here. But still struggling to get that punch. So if you do need to get a punch effect and you're going for something more aggressive, as we're appearingly trying to do here, you can still tell how a gain reduction is being applied. A lot is being applied and you're not really hearing it all that easily. That's when you kind of say, ooh, this is more of a bus compressor. It's more kind of gluing it together. But with this particular model, we have this SH mod control, and this is an additional control over the attack. Whereas as I bring this up, it will actually slow down the attack more. So we hopefully get to a spot or get to a zone where we're hearing a lot more of that punch. So let's experiment with that. There it is. Right? We still want to make sure we're seeing some gain reduction. So you can see, even trying very hard to get a lot of extra punch on what still is something similar to like a VCA feed-forward type compressor, very difficult to accomplish with something like this, whereas with the DC-182, not that hard because we have these additional controls on it. So still coming back to Nebula and their processors, very much have a specific purpose. Almost always have a specific purpose. And that's why when we bring the tan on and we bring it on to something like the master bus, we should be able to get more of like a gluing type effect happening here. So let's experiment a bit with that and then maybe compare it to the DC-182. So even as I'm trying to go for just a touch more punch, you can see how difficult it is because this is continuing to work more as that mix gel glue. And when we bring it in and out, you can sometimes really perceptually get a big difference on it. It really depends on the source material that's coming in. With some music, it's like a night and day difference. Because this is still a pretty sparse instrumentation, you're probably not going to hear it as much as if you were to do this over a full mix. But you can hear how it sits the drums in. And oftentimes you'll see people just tickle the meter ever so slightly. And we can compare that then to, say, the DC1A2. Right, and I would say that also has a very flattering effect on the master bus. So you don't always expect that it's going to do that or work for you. It's all about knowing your tools, knowing how to use them, how they can be used, how they've been used in the past. And if we wanted to add more punch into this, we quite easily could, because we do have these extra controls on here. So you can see that there's a big difficulty here, and that's because we don't have control over the independent attack and release. We'd want kind of like a slower attack, but a quicker release, whereas in this, we have kind of like an auto setting, but a very slow release time coming back. You can even see it on the meter. So I'm struggling to be able to set this up, which is why I would still probably go with something like, say, the TAN device in this case. And here we're just tickling the meter. Could even go with an additional dB of gain on the output. So you might listen to that and kind of argue, well, a little bit of the impact is taken away, but I would argue, I think, with listening to that and listening to it many times, that's a fair case. And if you really don't want to lose that, you wouldn't bring this on, but it does have the ability of also kind of bringing things in a little bit, taming things, even when we're trying to go for that little bit of extra snap. And you can hear how it does emphasize, especially on those claps, a little bit more of the transient. You do get that subtle bit of extra punch on the front end of that, but at the same time, it's still gluing it all together. Okay, and that's why a device like this, and with the Nebula stuff in general, you really need to know and understand what its purpose is, because this is very specific to the hardware. Whereas with plugins, a lot of times you can, or I should just say like the emulation plugins, more the algorithmic based plugins, you can put some settings in there and kind of get things to work or do things that you wouldn't normally do. But with the Nebula stuff, you always have to be thinking, what's the function? What has it been used for in the past? And that's probably the way you're going to want to try and apply it. So that's just a little bit of an explanation for you about the TAN, where it falls in line with all the other compressors that are out there. Like always, if you have any additional questions, please do not hesitate to ask. And I hope that you're able to apply this with your own music, and maybe it will do wonders for you. I certainly hope it does, and we'd love to hear all about it in the forum. So thank you a lot for your attention, and you'll catch us in the next bonus section where we're talking about maximization. So look forward to that. It's a lot of fun, and if you ever want to get your music really loud, that is the place to go. All right, thanks a lot. Take care.